Yes, welcome everybody. I was waiting on the camera woman in this case. I keep saying cameraman, but sure. I'd like to welcome everybody here to my talk, Pixel Perfect Pruning with Visual Regression Tests. The first talk, I think, at this event, so I'm quite honored that everybody's here. Thank you. First, a little bit about me before we jump into the actual content of this presentation. But this is me, Gabriel Moawad. I'm 32 years old. I'm living in Utrecht, really close by. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a hard walk because somebody said I had to bring a lot of gear with me. So if I'm sweating, you know where that's from. But yeah, I've been working at Capgemini now for almost 11 years. As you can see, for quite a lot of clients, because in consultancy, you just switch around jobs quite often, projects, I should say. I started at something called het Waterschapshuis. I'm not going to try and translate that because I don't have any idea where we'll get there. But that's basically the organization which manages all the stuff in our country with water. So that's quite nice. I built a website for those. Did something at Jeugdzorg, data visualization, which was quite cool with D3AS, for the people who might know. Then I took quite a long time at ABN AMRO, did quite some projects for abnamro.com, for internet banking, all those sorts of stuff. And then I had quite a stint in Paris, where I worked for a sister company of Capgemini called Itelios. Fast forward, I worked some time at the police, built police.nl, which is what they call the biggest police office in the Netherlands. I think it's always a bit of a weird name because I think not a lot of people go there for fun, but sure. And now I work at Boels, aka the rental company where we all know the toilets from, that sort of stuff. And there I built a headless CMS integration where we have quite some headless components, or dumb components I should say, which consume the headless data from the CMS. Personally, I love basketball, I love to travel, I play a lot of games, otherwise you're not a developer, I guess. And that's a little bit about me. And I think the first thing you all might notice is that visual regression testing, well, you might notice I lost some hair. So that's the first thing I think which is on brand for this talk. And that might come back a few times later on. So what are we going to talk about today? Like I said, visual regression testing, it's maybe a bit of an introductionary talk at first, just to walk through the basics. What is visual regression testing? What does it fix? How does the process work? Like you go through some steps to manage this progress around these tests. How we're going to implement this, and then I do a short demo on how it works actually. And then in the end, I want to talk about the best practices and also the downsides. Because honestly, even though I'm talking here about visual regression testing, I might not be the biggest fan of it, but I'll come back to that later. Spoiler alert, I should have said that beforehand, I guess. But so let's jump into it. What is visual regression testing? In short, you take some screenshots of web pages or components, depending on what you determine is valuable, and then you compare them against so-called baseline images, and you spot the difference. So say you have your website and you do a future release, and you might have changed some CSS. The visual regression tests should be able to see those changes and notify you of them. That's valuable because that way we know stuff has changed, and normally if you do a release, you want things to change, right? But there might be some regression somewhere else in your application which you didn't envision, and therefore it's nice to get a notification of that. Secondly, that's what I just said, the unexpected changes. If you work on a simple component on one side of your website, and well, we all try to prevent spaghetti code, but say there might be some styles which inherit somewhere else in your application. Those are the unexpected changes. So you think you fix something in component A, meanwhile the whole other part of the website has some unexpected changes, who might not be bad, but it's at least good to know they're there, right? And then, of course, last but not least, you can do this everywhere, you can do it locally, but I think the beautiful part of it is if you want to do this pre-release, you can implement it in your CI/CD pipelines, meaning that every time you deploy something, these tests will run, just like your unit test, like end-to-end test, whatever test you have, and therefore they're automatically checked every time you release something. So that makes it valuable in the sense that, in case something does happen, we're aware of it. So the benefits of this, it's consistent visual, and It's just predictable, right? Just with unit tests, it's not essentially different from that, only this is more on the visual part. So if you write a unit test, you want to see if the logic's still working. And my UX designer friends would love this to see that their beautiful designs are still intact. It also, defends the brand's identity. I don't know if you guys ever encountered something like this, but I've worked at quite some projects now, and sometimes you go live and you think everything's just fine, and then all of a sudden your designer or tester comes at your desk, rambling down your screen like, what the hell is this, dude? And you weren't aware of it. But if you have this, you would be. So that's a key benefit to it as well. And it's just simpler because if you don't know where these issues are coming from, say 3 months down the line, somebody spots that bug, you don't know where it's coming from, right? If you get it immediately, you're still in the mindset of, hey, I fixed this. So it might be easier to identify where that bug is coming from. Essentially, the changes until that point are also a lot smaller, right? Because if you just do one commit and you see that the pipeline's failing, you know it should be in that commit. Well, if your tester is coming 3 months later, you get this whole backlog of commits which you need to dive through, which might be quite a headache. And that's something we try to prevent with these tests. And I think the key of this all is you have happy testers and designers. And I would say maybe even happy developers, because if they're not bothering me, that makes my life easier as well, right? But testers and designers, well, testers especially, because they build tests, but designers are not used to this level of validity of your website, at least not on the projects I've worked on before this, because we call it sort of monkey testing, right? They have to walk through the whole page, see if everything's still in place, etc. And with these tests, that's done for them. And I think that's a little bit of the what does it fix phase. Before implementing these types of stuff, your team, it might be a bit exaggerated, but over-exaggerated, I should say. Your QA team is always living in stress, like, okay, we're going live, we know the unit tests are working, we know the logic is still in place, but is everything visually okay still? We have to walk through that. So in case, we call that struggling to catch all the issues, it might be quite labor-intensive if you have to walk through every case on every viewport and every device to see if everything's still up to date, right? And most of the time, it's like the small edge cases which get broken down, so you might not even catch them. So that manual testing stuff, that's part of the past if you do it like this. So if you don't do that, it might lead to repeated post-release bugs, especially if you have those bugs which keep reoccurring every now and then. You want to filter those out. And basically, if you have this, you don't have to do hot fixes because you catch them beforehand. Your developers and product owner would probably trust the situation more and go live more comfortable. So all in all, that makes your process a bit more sturdy. And what I think the biggest benefit of this is if you do hot fixes every now and then, it disrupts your sprint, right? Because you're focusing on some user stories in your sprint. And all of a sudden, the tester pops up and says, this and that is broken. We need to fix it immediately. So it grabs you out of your current work and gets you in a sort of alert state to get that hotfix running. If you fix that beforehand, you don't have to worry about it. So your sprint might be a lot more calm and relaxed, and you can just focus on the stuff you really should be working at, adding value. So how does this work? It's quite easy, actually. It's just 3 steps. You set those baseline images because you need a case beforehand, right, where you compare it to. So say you have a component the first time you release it, you set a baseline image of it. And whenever you release it, you jump through this process. So first time you do something new to it, it will verify all those images against the current situation. If everything's working correctly, it's quite nice. You don't have to do anything because it will just give you a check mark. Everything's okay. And we continue our build. It might get interesting at the point that things start to change. Some changes might be intentional, because say you get a use story where a button needs to look different. Your test case will fail, but it's not really a failure, right? The end goal is that you see that it looks different, but therefore you have to set a new baseline, because that's now how a button should look like. In the other case, where you see regressions which you didn't anticipate on, it might be better to go and fix those regressions because that's not what you anticipated on and you want to catch that bug firsthand, and you go back, you fix it, and you run the pipeline again. And then he will, of course, check it all over again, and hopefully then it will pass. So in that case, originally you want everything to pass, but if you keep updating your UI, you will have to set new baselines, right? Because it looks different now, you want different baselines. So it's more of a process of, okay, things have changed, yeah, this is intentional, accept it, and we continue. Or it might be a mix, where some things do indeed are intentional, but some things weren't intentional. So you need to partly go back and fix those edge cases as well. But how does that look? It's quite easy. Whenever you run these tests, you have your reference image, the baseline I said, you have your test case, and then the difference will be highlighted in sort of a fuchsia magenta pink. So you are aware, like, okay, this is what I changed. I can tell you this change wasn't intentional, well, where I did it myself, of course, but it was time. And in this case, I probably need to accept that this is the new baseline, unfortunately, because going back to that might be a ticket to Istanbul, might be expensive, whatever. We're not going to do that. So yeah, in this case, we have a reference image, we see the difference. Okay, I'm now bald, yay, I accept it, and I go on with my life. It's easier said than done, guys. And now you might be thinking, why are all these lemures on all these images, right? Well, the library which I use in this demo for this is called BackstopJS, and their logo is a lemur, so that's why. And it's quite easy, it's just an npm package, you can install it globally in your project, whatever. And then, of course, you need to do some configuration. But like I said, there's multiple ways to implement this. Locally, old-fashioned, you just have it in your package.json, you run it locally, maybe pre-commit, whatever. But I think the real value, like I just said, is whenever you do it in your pipeline. Because that's how you, how do you say that? Make it sort of a standard for your whole team, right? You don't want to be the only person who does this, because then whenever your teammates are still not checking it, you still have those issues. So I would say make this a part of your pipeline if you plan to do this, simply because that's where the most value is added. Utility-wise, you can do it cross-browser, cross-device, cross-viewport, cross whatever I have left in these bullet points, I guess. Yeah. Because, of course, you have these scenarios where you can test your website and it works, but if you go to maybe your mobile view or maybe a tablet view of whatever view you have anticipated, some things might change on those. So you can determine what are these scenarios, how are we going to use them on cross-browser, cross-device, and that helps you. And I think most importantly is you can test singular components, just like isolated component, maybe a button like I just mentioned, or even full pages. I think there's no right or wrong there. It's just, whatever you deem necessary. I can also envision you might do a combination of those, but we'll get back to that in the parts where I'm not as happy about visual regression testing, like I mentioned. But we'll get back to that, because I think most importantly, it's good to see it in action. What I've done is, and now I need to share my screen a little bit different than I was doing already. Duplicate. What I've done is a simple repository, or project, I should say, where I have implemented BackstopJS. It's not that fancy. We just have some small components in there. I've hosted those with Fractal, which is a small storybook-like design system. And I just created some scenarios to display to you guys how this works. So whenever you run this, of course, like I said, you install Backstop, and in this case also Fractal, because those are the two things we're running here. And you have something called BackstopJSON, which is just the config. And when we go top to bottom from here, you'll see we have Backstop default case in this case, and I have 3 viewports defined here. I have one for phones with a width and a height. I have one for your tablet view with a width and a height, and one for desktop. So what does this mean? Every test case you do is done 3 times on these different viewports. Like I said, that might be valuable whenever you have different views, right? Then you have some on before and on ready scripts, which essentially is just some cleanup stuff. But here you see the scenarios. Yes, you can wildcard this as well, so don't cry already when you see everything being explicitly defined here. But for the sake of this demo, I just have one example component, a secondary example component, and a component where these two are inherited in the same component. And the big thing to know here is we have 3 scenarios here and we have 3 viewports here. So you see that it exponentially grows already, right? Because 3 times 3 is 9. Whenever you create more viewports, whenever you create more tests, it might rise quite quickly. And Then below here, you have some places where he stores those bitmap images of those screenshots. You have the test cases, the reference cases, those are the baselines, and basically the before and afters. You can see here he creates an HTML report where you can just, it gets displayed like I just shown in my boldface towards where I had hair, where you see the difference. And like you see here, the engine is Puppeteer. People might know that already. There's also some small Express server running behind there. And I believe there's another one which essentially compares the screenshots, resemble.js from the top of my head. That works as well. That's already in there. What happens here is you have some other not as fancy config details. It's not that important. But it's just good to know that we have these cases defined in here and the viewports defined as well. Like I said, I have some simple components here. It's just, maybe if I open them, I can show it. This one is just inheriting that example1 and example2 component. And those example components are just sort of toaster messages, alert messages, with some text in there. And I'll show them in the front end as well, because I think that's more important. This is that fractal environment. Here we have that example overview case where we have beautiful components. Please don't bash me on the bottom one, because accessibility-wise, I think there are enough other talks to talk about that. But that's the one, and example 1 and 2 are just the same ones, only singular, isolated. So whenever we go to our terminal in this case, you can see there I have the fractal instance running. Whoa, that's really beautiful. I'll run it again because I don't know what happened there. It doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that he started up that fractal environment. And whenever you have that running, we host these URLs I just showed, right? Because it's running on your local host. So this URL is now up and running. And then if we go to another terminal, I can show it in the package.json. I have 2 tasks, one for the backstop test and one to approve them. Just a simple demo, because if you want to approve single ones, you of course have to give arguments which one you accept and which one you don't. But in this case, let's run it firsthand where we didn't change anything. So what happens is I run backstop. You will see some beautiful command line stuff where he sees, hey, I've selected 3 of 3 scenarios. He will run through them, create screenshots, compare those to your baseline. It's always fun in demos when they're slower than when you prepared it, right? But we'll get there. Yay, everything's running. And bam, he creates that reporting tool automatically. So here you see he passed 9 of the cases, because we had the 3 viewports and the 3 components, right? And 0 of them failed. So if you look here, essentially there's nothing really exciting here, because the references are all similar to the test, right? We didn't change anything. So in this case, if you build this into your pipeline, we would just continue, because nothing changed. Everything is similar to the reference case, so we just continue. And we go further on with our build, deployment, whatever we have configured in that pipeline. But if we change something, and this might be a good time to get rid of that awful blue background color. Where did I put that? And now is the question, it was this one. So let's make it gray, for instance, and I save it. And I run the same tests again, because now in the front end, we should see after we refresh it, that this one, example 2, oh, I probably screwed it up. It was example 1. Has turned gray. So now we expect something to change, right? Because we have a different color. So in our tests, which are running now, we already see some red lines, which honestly you shouldn't be too excited about. But now you see 3 have passed, which is that one singular component, right? The purple one. And 6 have failed. So it's quite hard to see, but this is the purple-ish. Purple and purple was not a good idea, guys. Oh no, this is the blue one. So the purple identicates like, hey, this background color has changed. Now you see the reference is blue, the test is gray, so something has changed there. And of course you see this for all viewports because we have those 3 cases. But now becomes the why it's 6 failed, because we had that one component which had both components in there, right? So those are failing as well. Even though the top one hasn't changed, the bottom one has. So you get a notification of what happens here. And now it's quite, important. What are you going to do with it? In this case, we wanted to get rid of that ugly blue. So we'll just accept them. I have a task for that as well. Ta-da! And then you will sort of create a new, I thought this was the case. Oh, let me check in the package.json, approve. Of course, what's a demo without a typo, guys? It's part of the deal. Now he starts to approve them, all of them, and you see it quite easily. He sees the following files will be promoted to reference, because those test files, which was used for identification, are now promoted and stored in that folder, which does, set them as the new baseline. So if we do this again right now, and we run the test, he will probably say 9 approved again. Good to know for people whenever you do this in your CI/CD pipeline. He creates all these artifacts in this folder called backstop data. So you see the folder here with the reference files, with the test files. Probably the test files aren't something you want to save, right? Because whenever you do them, whatever. Or you might want to even host this report if you want in your pipeline. So whenever you go back, you can still see them. Those are also hosted here in the HTML report folder. So it becomes quite easy to host these artifacts if you're using Azure or whatever pipeline vendor you're using to keep this as sort of documentation of all your releases. And that makes it really valuable because even if they fail, you can still see why they failed because you have those reports. I see the test has finished and I see no red text. And now you see indeed that we've passed 9 out of 9 again. And now our new baseline is the gray one. So that's quite neat in the sense of that we can just hustle around with it. This works quite fast locally, as you can imagine, but if you do this in a pipeline, you host these baselines somewhere. So you probably have to accept them either locally and re-upload them, or you have to build some logic where you have sort of a switch case where you can do that same path in your pipeline as well. Going back to this test, what makes this kind of iffy, and now we get into the part where you might not want to do this, or even if you do it, think it through, because I've had some beautiful bad practices of this at some clients of mine, where they did these tests on the live website. Well, what do we know about live websites? They change content-wise, right? So think about a news website. If we run a baseline image of that news website, and tomorrow, probably in 10 minutes with these sites nowadays, something new is posted, the test will fail, and I can show that here as well. Because if we go to one of these components, here, components, example 1, sure. This is the text which is displayed in the component, right? And I change it in demo at Frontmania, I save it, and I run the same test. Now it will fail, but not because we changed styling. It will fail simply because it's comparing 2 screenshots, and the text in there has changed. I love how we had this in place and we had a failure every single time. And I think that was a good lesson to stop testing on a live site. So my tip in this case is, and that's why I love to do it in a fractal or storybook type of environment, you can isolate it. You can always have the same content there. Or maybe you have a test environment which isn't changed content-wise as often. But you see it here. The reference and the test visually are the same, or CSS-wise, I should say, but he highlights that the text has changed. And yes, it works. Of course, it's a change, but as a developer, what do I need to do to make this work? Nothing, probably accept it and just continue. But ideally, you don't want to have this, because it creates a lot of clutter in your pipeline. It's going to host this, you have to accept it, blah, 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 blah. So whenever you do this in an isolated environment, it becomes a lot, more consistent. And what I also want to show with this is, this is funny, he just says 3 are failed and not the 3 other one from the combined component, where I would expect the text has also changed. Okay, it didn't change here, sure. Flaky, that's what I wanted to say. Sometimes the bigger the pages get, there's sort of a threshold in there, and you can configure that as well. For instance, sometimes your browser version changes and everything shifts maybe a pixel There's some configuration you can do in Backstop where you can do a sort of acceptance on the threshold. Like if it's 80% the same, you can accept it. If it's whatever number you deem visible for it. Yeah, you can play around with it, but it sort of defeats the purpose, right? Because if you create sort of a percentage in there and things do change, it sort of, yeah, becomes just like a false positive. Was it intentional? Was it just the browser version being updated? Whatever. So when you do this, it uses Puppeteer, which is a headless browser. Make sure to configure that consistently. Give it a version, give it everything you need, so that doesn't change with the display of the screenshot, essentially. So it's hard to create sort of a baseline in that. And I think that's where we get into the part of the presentation where I want to talk about the best practices. I said it already, test in isolation. Dynamic content is your enemy with this stuff. Sometimes you might want to play around with dynamic content because you can create edge cases, right? What happens when I have the same component with a large title? What happens when I have, I don't know, no input for it? You might want to test that, but do that in isolation as well. Because if you fall back on live content for that, you don't know what the editor's filling in there. So unless you might want to talk with them all the time, but I don't think that's a feasible way of working either. So if you do it in an isolated environment, it becomes quite easy for you as a developer to maintain. It's not that different from unit tests, right? In unit tests, you write your function with the same properties every now and then. So it's not different here. 2, governance. Just like with every type of coding, we all do it in a different way, right? Therefore, we have code conventions. For this, we need to discuss something as well. How do you deal with these baseline images? Whenever you create a new component, because then the exciting stuff happens, because then you need to write new scenarios, right? So make sure your team all does that the same, because otherwise there might be some inconsistencies there. And I think what's most important with that is also incorporate your designer. The designer is sort of the end-all be-all when it comes to the visual part of your application, right? We're just the goofies who implement it. So in that sense, make them sort of the owner of what is tested. Yeah, you're probably writing the test case, but if they know what's tested, what's validated, it makes their life a lot easier. So let them own that part of the pipeline. And I think test everything, that's why it's in parentheses. It's a bit of a weird one. Yeah, you want to test everything in the sense of you want to make sure that it works, but this, just like as shown in the demo, do you want to show the whole tree of it? We have some components. Those components are inherited in a parent component. I don't know if you guys know atomic design, but there things might grow insanely big. When you test everything, yeah, sure, you know how it's working. Sure, but you're testing the same component in its parents probably again, and again in that parent, and et cetera, et cetera. So when you test everything, make sure you test everything once. That should be the message. And like I said in the beginning, it's up to you to determine, is that on page level or just on the isolated components? It's a bit of a tricky one, because I know if you do it on component base, you have everything, but those components interact with each other, right? It could be that the component itself did not change, but maybe the spacing between components. So then you want to check its parent. But there you get already into the discussion of what's smarter, and then you get into, just test everything at all. And if we do that, we come into the territory of performance. Because like I just said, if you do 3 viewports, you check everything in your atomic design system, it becomes quite cumbersome already. It grows quite a lot, and it's in your pipeline, so your end user probably won't have any issues with it. But in an era we live in now, where time to market is really important, and we might do daily releases, it might be tricky to run a part of your pipeline, which might take half an hour, depending on how big your project is, right? There is one best practice I have to make sure this isn't happening for your product. And that is whenever you're in a project with a separate design system, you can run those tests on the design system, and that the components in that design system are consumed by your website, right? So if your website pipeline isn't doing these visual tests, but just the design system, then you already cut that part out. But it depends how visually, how do you say that? How much your visual identity of your website changes. Because if that happens a lot, then this might not be the perfect solution. Limited insights. It's a bit of a weird one because I've been just telling you guys, you see every change, etc., etc. But it's just a visual change. You don't get to the nature of the issue. With a unit test, you create your cases. You see, hey, this part of the case is failing. I can just reproduce that, right? When you see a visual change, you don't know where in the CSS that might have occurred. Could be everywhere. So in a unit test where you get sort of help like, hey, this is now not working again, here we just see what's not working and you're still the one who needs to research why that occurred. So in that sense, it helps, but not in the same way as our unit tests usually do. And this is the big part of it, why I think it's a bit of a weird one to talk about this, because honestly, I might not be the biggest fan of it, like I said. It encourages overly strict visual consistency. I think it depends on who you work with, but you know, some designers might be little pixel perfect on everything you do, right? When they get a tool as powerful as this, you sort of enhance that trait of them. So they start to see every pixel that has changed, and they'll be at your desk way more often. For me, yeah, I think some changes, especially in a responsive environment, things scale. So should we check every pixel? Should we check if things are still visually how they should look? Yeah, okay, that's true, but we can see that with our eyes as well. But then you get into the tricky territory of doing it manual versus doing it automatic. So honestly, I think it depends really on what for project you're working on. If you're working at a visual brand, maybe a clothing brand who really is strict on things like this, it might be of added value. If you work on a governmental site where you have a component set which all look simply the same and maybe a border shuffles a bit, yeah, how bad is that? So today I explained to you guys how it all works, but I also want you to be critical of should we use this? Because yeah, it's a cool tool and it works and it does what it should do, but talking about the way of working inside your team, it might create some sort of overhaul. And especially when this diverts the direction from harder issues, right? The more valuable user stories on our backlog which we need to deliver. I don't know how I'm going with the time because I'm already sort of coming towards to the end. So I'm really curious if there are any questions from the audience. I see a hand over there.
Yes. Do you know vtest?
Sorry?
Do you know vtest?
Yeah.
There is vtest the browser in there and it runs on Playwright or WebDriver. Can it also run this backstop.js?
Yeah. It's just, I think in the configuration, you can just say which one it uses. It's similar. You also have Cypress and those type of tools. Under the, how do you call it, the trunk, whatever. It's all sort of similar. Of course, the way you configure it is a bit different. But yeah, same. I saw two hands at the same time, so let's start on the left. I'll come to you in a second.
What about collapsible components? Is this framework capable of spotting that?
Yeah, it depends on how you want to do that. There are more ways to roam in that sense, because in a design system like Fractal, you can create cases and then you just point towards the different URLs. But I believe if you combine it with unit test, there's also click handlers in there. And you can just walk through interactions and then screenshot those as well. Yeah, your question?
Have you experienced any differences on different systems? Like if you do the same test on Windows or in macOS?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a pain in the ass in that sense. But you can determine in which browsers he does the tests. In your pipeline, and that's why default runs on Puppeteer, I guess, which is Chromium, I guess, one of those two. Just configure everything to be the same version, and then you'll eliminate that. The tough part in that is your audience, the end user, might use different versions, right? So that's, again, coming into that exponential growth of baselines. If you want to test it all, you have to test a lot, and then your tests take a longer time. So yeah, you can sort of cut it off for your test, but you don't know how it would react in the real world. And to do so, you have to implement it. So again, a good issue to determine if you really need this or not.
So what is then the impact on the size of the repo if you save all those images?
Yeah, they become quite big. And I think Depends on which pipeline runner you use, but you can also save them as artifacts in your Azure cloud or whatever. But indeed, they become quite big. And that's also something to, how do you say that? Discuss, right? Is it worth it or not? But you can just do it the same as you do with a package JSON. Have all those images not in the repository itself and just download them, or maybe create them the first time you run it. So in that sense, you don't have to worry about cloning the repo size-wise, but eventually it will become big with all those images, yes. I see a lot of hands. Let's start at the right back.
Can you define inside your benchmark snapshot areas that you don't want to test or areas that you want to test less?
Yeah, not the less part. You can do ignore parts, yeah. There's also more ways to roam on that. I've seen some funny stuff where a developer thought, I don't want to see this part of the content in the screenshots. So he just created an additional CSS which put that part on display none. That works, but you can also indeed highlight parts to ignore. But then if you shuffle a bit and things run out of that area, it becomes, yeah, a bit iffy. So that's the whole thing with screenshots, right? It's not dynamic as code is. It's just a simple bitmap image you test. But there are things to do that with, yeah. There was another question, yeah.
Is it compatible with the Azure pipeline tasks?
Yeah.
For example, if I have to publish the artifacts using the publish artifact task, the by default inbuilt task of Azure,
Yeah.
will I be able to publish the report?
Yes, everything actually. So the images, the report, like I just shown, I can show it again, let me see. Just like with every other build you do, you get a dist folder or whatever, right? This is the folder for the backstop data. So he has all the images in there, he has the report in there, and you can just host it from the Azure pipeline.
It requires a Chromium browser. So for example, in pipelines, we need the drivers to be installed already on the agent pool.
Yeah.
Right, so do we need to install only Chromium, or let's say if there is some other browser or some other driver installed, will it be compatible?
Yeah, so if you do that npm install of Backstop, of course Backstop has his own dependencies as well, and he just brings that with him. So probably early on in your pipeline you do an npm build or whatever, right?
So driver will automatically come with this package.
Yeah. Here on the front, I know your name, Taima.
First, I want to say I love your presentation. I was just wondering, would you recommend something like this with just snapshots? Or is it a bit of overkill?
I think overkill. I think maybe people have already noticed from this presentation, it works, but I think it's quite overkill already. So just like alcohol, use it with mate, we say in the Netherlands. So I think if you have that already, yeah. And just like I said, it's something you might have to discuss with your quality assurance team, right? If your designers think it's valuable, then I think they determine more if it's needed or not. But it has quite some impact on your use stories in general, right? Because just like writing unit tests takes some time to maybe apply to your definition of done, this does as well. So especially if you start greenfield, it might be okay to start doing this because it's not as much. But if you have a big system already up and running, it becomes quite big to implement this. Another
Question, are there ways to incorporate it into Storybook, for example?
Yeah, it's same like Fractal. Like I shown, in the configuration, it does nothing more than just check certain URLs. So in Storybook, you can also get a URL of an isolated component. And then he just goes to that page and does the screenshot. So in this case, he just goes the same way to a preview URL of that component. In Storybook, it doesn't work any different. You might need to do some magic with the URL because it's in your pipeline probably, and this is all locally, but yes, it works.
How is this different from Playwright, for example, right? Nowadays, Playwright is very much trending in the market.
Yeah.
And writing end-to-end test or any regression test using Playwright is
Yeah, it's not that different.
very simple.
No.
If you know normal JavaScript, you can write it.
Yeah, it's not that different indeed. I think Playwright, if I'm right, also, hey, funny, not intended. Also, there's a lot of unit test stuff on the side, right? It's more end-to-end in that sense. And this is more focused on just comparing screenshots. So in that sense, I think this is more lightweight, but if you have Playwright already up and running, go for that. Any other questions? Then I'd like to thank everybody for their visit to my talk. If you want to talk about